Genies are trickier creatures to try and toss into your D&D games. I mean, they are loaded with lore from not just Wizards of the Coast, but from hundreds, if not thousands of years of mythology. The biggest feature some DMs have trouble integrating is their ability to grant wishes, which ranges from dungeon masters simply ignoring that feature to abusing the hell out of it and breaking their own game. And so the goal of today's encounter, apart from making it fun and engaging, is to create an NPC who can grant wishes that your players won't abuse. Hello, my name is Matt, and welcome to my hidden nerdy side, and today we're tackling the fiery genies known as Efreeti. We are going to take a look at their lore, info, and abilities, and then build an encounter you can steal, modify, and plop straight into your D&D games. And to make sure this video is a decent length, we'll only be pulling the Efreeti lore, info, and abilities that exist in the monster manual, which can be found on pages 141, 142, and 145. So without further ado, let's take a look at Efreeti. Now, there is a lot of genie lore, and most of it is about genies in general, but to quickly sum it up, genies are powerful, brilliant, and very rare creatures who primarily reside in the elemental planes, and they are as mighty as they are egotistical, since genies believe only other genies and the gods themselves can rival their might. This is probably because really powerful genies have the ability to grant wishes, which admittingly is quite an impressive feat, but this also makes them the target of other creatures who want to bind a genie to its service and abuse its wish-making abilities. Genies are elemental spirits given a physical form, and are born when a soul of a sentient creature becomes infused with the primordial matter of the material plane. And even if that occurs, it's still a long shot that a genie will actually be born from that process. Now, genies have slaves and view them as living property, but genies also derive a sense of value from the amount of property they own and the quality of it. So genies actually treasure their slaves and treat them with honor, until they step out of line, in which case they will, of course, beat the crap out of them, but not to the point where the slave would lose its value. However, this applies to genies in general, but when we jump to Efreet, and yes, that is the plural of Efreeti, they are genies who dwell in the elemental plane of fire, and are quite a bit crueler to their slaves. Basically, Efreets view all other creatures as potential slaves and try to capture as many as possible. They rule over them in very oppressive ways, and only promote slaves to positions of power who can illustrate a similar level of cruelness as their Efreeti master. Efreeti are deceptive, cunning, and truly just nasty creatures who really only care about themselves, and spend their days raiding different planes of existence, gathering slaves, treasures, and beautiful trinkets to decorate themselves in. Now, when we jump to the actions and abilities of our almighty, powerful genie, honestly, they kinda suck. Don't get me wrong, they aren't bad or anything, but these are creatures who apparently challenge gods, yet all they can really do is fly, cast a few spells, and hit you a couple of times. So instead, we're going to jump straight to our homebrew changes, and talk about things we can add to make your Efreeti encounter really memorable. In fact, I'm even going to supply you guys with a new improved Efreeti stat block, so grab it in the description below. First, we are going to up its multi-attack so it can make 3 attacks with its scimitar, but still only 2 attacks with its hurl flame to keep it balanced. But we are going to up its spell save DC to 18 and its spell attack to +10, because you aren't hitting gods with a +7. Next, we are going to give our Efreeti more fire spells. Now, its hurl flame is pretty strong, but other than that, it can only use wall of fire and conjure a fire elemental, which is good, but we can give it some more stuff. So our Efreeti will be able to cast Fireball, Scorching Ray at 4th level, and Fire Shield once a day. Then we are also going to play with the ability Hurl Flame by giving our Efreeti Manipulate Flame. With this, so long as there is a source of fire within 120 feet of our Efreeti, it can choose to cast Hurl Flame from it instead of himself. He will also be able to use this trait once per turn as a lair action. This is a great way to play into the lore surrounding their manipulation of fire, while also adding more interactions with the environment into your combat scenarios. Simply Simply toss a few torches around your battlefield and you're good to go. And finally, our Efreeti is going to obtain a cool mythic action, where once it drops below 50 hit points, our Efreeti immediately jumps into a pit of flames or lava within 60 feet of him, and harnesses the power of fire to transform into a gargantuan fire elemental, gaining 40 temporary hit points, becoming absolutely massive in size, and essentially obtaining an amped up fire elemental stat block. Because a red guy hitting you with a sword, not so memorable, but a creature who sends balls of fire from all directions before turning into an enormous ball of fire itself, now that's a memorable encounter. They still won't be soloing gods anytime soon, but at least they can now feel like a genuine threat. Okay, so now that we've gone over the basic Efreeti lore, info, and abilities, let's build an encounter. This encounter/quest will be aimed at parties level 9 to 14 depending on how difficult you want to make it, and last about 2 to 4 sessions depending on how much you want to stretch it out. The party's motivation should always be tailored to your campaign, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just say your party will be hearing about this evil being all campaign long, and will finally be in a perfect situation to do something about it when an NPC they need is taken by them. Also, the reward will be quite appealing. Now, this series of encounters requires a bit of lore setup. So this is Gokano, and he is going to be our Efreeti. He is an almighty Efreeti who has thousands of slaves, and is a famous figure in your world. Not many people have seen Gokano and lived to tell the tale, but tales of his exploits have become legend as he travels from plane to plane, raiding, pillaging, kidnapping, and anything else he pleases, and has been doing so for hundreds of years. Gokano rarely uses his wish-granting powers for others, and when he does, there's usually a ridiculously high price to pay, or the wish in some way serves his own selfish purposes. Now, that's all information the regular, common-day person would know, but what most people don't know is one day when raiding in a far-off plane, he came across a beautiful woman named Elathine. This woman treated Gokano like a god, pumped up his ego, and was subservient in every way possible. You know, all the features Gokano likes in a woman. However, Elathine was no fool, and in fact, this was all an act to gain Gokano's trust and bear him a child. For you see, Elathine was actually born of a powerful bloodline from a plane Gokano stripped bare many years ago, and wanted to use her powers to stop Gokano's terror. Using immensely impressive binding magic instilled in the bloodline of her people, she was able to seal part of Gokano's power into their newborn son, stripping Gokano of his wish-granting powers by requiring both Gokano and his newborn son to agree on a wish before it can be gifted. However, Gokano was able to catch onto her schemes and killed Elathine before she could escape with their son, who Gokano named Singe. At first, Gokano was able to manipulate the child into agreeing on wishes whenever he deemed necessary. Unfortunately, the binding magic was so powerful that not even Gokano's wishes could undo it, but it didn't matter so long as Singe played his part. However, as Singe grew up, he became more and more disgusted with his father's work and the abuse of his servants, and so Singe ended up escaping from his father in the middle of the night. Years have gone by since then, and now Gokano tirelessly hunts his son while continuing to look up potential alternatives to get his power back, while Singe, feeling guilty for playing his part for so long, spends his days trying to free his father's slaves, dismantle his operations, and atone for his sins. Woo! Okay, so with all that juicy lore created, now it's time to build encounters around it and plan for ways for it to slowly but surely slip out to your players. Well, first you have to establish Gokano's legend in your world. This can easily be done through NPC stories, linking player backstories to this new lore, history checks, and any other standard stuff. Anything that gets the name Gokano in your player's head early on in your game is great. However, eventually eventually your players will come across a town that is absolutely excelling. How they're excelling is up to you, but for this example, we'll say their crops are the biggest and juiciest your players have ever seen. What's weird though is this area used to be quite barren, so it's odd it's currently doing so well. Now you could create an entire quest surrounding the discovery of why the crops are so miraculously amazing, but you could also just have an NPC in the town your players work with spill the beans after any quest you give them, because essentially the town is doing so well because Gokano has been visiting many towns and offering wishes in exchange for slaves, and this town accepted his offer. Now that's obviously really messed up on the town's behalf, but what's important is this is quite out of character for Gokano. I mean, he is known for taking slaves, but offering wishes so freely doesn't align with his character at all, particularly since it seems he sought out to offer wishes. But anyways, this is all set up to make Gokano a living presence in your world. The actual interactions with him won't happen till much later, and when your players either need to find an NPC to complete a quest or are traveling to meet an NPC they've become great friends with. It doesn't matter. But when your players are going to visit this person, they'll see two flying pirate ships docked at a town attacking and kidnapping villagers. This is when your players will catch their first glimpse of your almighty Efreeti hucking bolts of fire at anyone who opposes him, as his army of humanoid, monstrous, and elemental servants fight the town's guards and drag the town's people onto their ships. Apart from typical bandit, pirate, and fire elemental stat blocks, mephits, salamanders, fire snakes, and fire snails are all possible minion options. But again, mix, match, and add as you see fit. Now, shortly after your players arrive, Gokano will start to sail away with a batch of slaves, while the other ship remains to finish the job. Now, there will be villagers running around and guards pathetically trying to stop the 10 to 20 minions that stayed behind. However, there will also be another person fighting back against Gokano's men, an elven magic user by the name Emanos. After helping Emanos defeat Gokano's men, your party will discover the NPC they were looking for was captured and is most likely being taken back to Gokano's island in the elemental plane of fire. Emanos will then introduce himself and tell the party he has been freeing slaves from Gokano's different outposts for years and knows quite a bit about his operation. Emanos will then also explain Gokano's entire situation to your players. He'll tell them about what Elithine did to his wish powers and that Gokano's son escaped. Emanos will then also share an additional piece of information, which is Gokano is getting desperate and is gathering tens of thousands of slaves in order to perform a ritual that might be able to break the magical seal and give Gokano his wish powers back, which is why he was handing out wishes like candy in exchange for people. However, he obviously couldn't do that anymore once Singe left, so he has resulted to going on tons of kidnapping raids. So unless your party wants an evil guy to become super powerful again, while also sacrificing their NPC friend in the process, your players will probably want to stop Gokano. But would you look at that, the minions your players just murdered were kind enough to leave a flying astral ship capable of traversing planes of existence behind. Wow, aren't they nice? And to top it all off, Emanos will promise a reward of 25,000 gold. But don't worry, we'll get to how that unfolds in a bit. Piloting the ship will be a batch of slaves, but they will be more than happy to sail your players to Gokano's island. Because you see, Gokano has owned slaves for so long that they have formed families and bred on his island for generations. So the slaves will help your party if they agree to free their families. Now, Emanos is actually Singe using illusionary magic to disguise himself. The reason he is doing so is because he knows it will be much more difficult for your players to trust him if they know he's actually a fire genasi and the son of the person they're currently going to murder. So Singe will continue to hide his appearance for as long as possible. So your players will travel with Singe into the elemental plane of fire, talking, bonding, and planning their attack on the way. Singe will share any information he has that doesn't pertain to his true identity, including the general layout of his father's island. Now, the final encounter is going going to be a beefy one, but you could toss in some extra encounters during their travels that make sense for their current situation. One example would be having a guarded checkpoint looking over all the ships passing into Gokano's territory, causing your players to have to be creative to escape without incident, or they can just kill everyone if they want. Any additional encounters you add is your call, but once your players park their fire-immune boat on a river of lava flowing to Gokano's island, there will be the main area where all the slaves will be, and Gokano's keep, which is basically a castle where Gokano and his higher-ranking forces rest. Singe will tell the players that simply storming the keep will be practically impossible, since your players aren't strong enough to take on literally hundreds of minions and Gokano. But, as has been demonstrated, the slaves on the island are not loyal to Gokano at all, and all it takes is a spark of hope to reinvigorate the people. So your player's job at this point is to inspire and organize the slaves, so that they can cause enough of a distraction where your players and Singe can make it past the gates of Gokano's keep and face him mano a mano. Now this is entirely your call how you want to run this or how your players want to go about it. Anything from stealthing around, pretending to be slaves themselves, just running around and killing stuff, or anything else is their call to make. But the planned endgame is to have enough slaves so they can cause a big enough riot where your players can head straight to Gokano. We'll say 300 is the magic number needed to be guaranteed passage to Gokano, so your players need to convince 300 people to join their fight, and these people will be located throughout the main area. And if your players don't reach the magic number, the greater chance there is of Gokano's forces busting in on your players and their final confrontation with Gokano, which obviously would make it more difficult and deadly. So your players will be going around the camp and will have to use their noggins to persuade these people. Some will join easily, while others will be more hesitant after years of abuse. How you want to manage that is up to you, but what are some ways we can incentivize your players to think more creatively and engage with the environment around them? Well, one way would be to beef up your slaves with weapons and armor. So put an armory in the island's main area where weapons and armor for Gokano soldiers and their clients are crafted. If your players take it over, they'll be able to outfit your slave army with better gear, reducing the number of people required to cause a riot by 50, since they will be able to better handle the upcoming fight. Another method is to invade the mines and find explosives. On the island, there will be a mine where Gokano slaves will work during the day to find metals and ore for the weapons and armor we discussed earlier. But within this mine, there will be plenty of dynamite, and this dynamite can be used to blow up the walls where the gate to Gokano's keep is attached, allowing your players to enter the keep with ease. If your players are able to obtain this dynamite, we'll say they will need to convince 50 less people, since they won't have to waste more lives trying to bring down the gate. And finally, in the main slave pit, where most of them will be, we'll say there will be some slave leaders who are heavily influential, and if your players are able to convince them to join their side, your players will automatically gain 100 people for their army, since the leaders will use their influence to recruit them. These are just a few examples, but please, go ahead and change them up as you see fit. But I would recommend placing your slave activities far away from each other, so your players can have fun stopping guards from getting reinforcements. After your players manage to handle many of Gokano's forces on the main island and build up their slave army, you then simply have to narrate the charge and what happens as your players plow through the gates. The slaves will be letting out war cries as they get revenge on their masters, and your players will march straight to Gokano's throne room to take him down. Then, using all the homebrew shenanigans we mentioned earlier, an epic battle will commence. We'll say Gokano will have 10 to 20 pirates with him, along with 1 to 2 hellhounds and 2 to 4 flame skulls with him, depending on your party's size and skill. And to be extra deadly for high-level parties, you can toss a couple of Gricks in there as well to unleash a stealthy surprise. But after your players defeat Gokano, before the final lethal blow can be dealt, your players will see Singe drop his illusionary magic, revealing his true identity, and then will cast a powerful binding spell using his mother's ancient bloodline, which will bind his father into his service and allow Singe to freely grant wishes. To thank your players, Singe will grant them a wish. However, this wish can only be worth up to 25,000 gold, which will count as their reward. This gives you the freedom to grant your players whatever they want while still being able to rein in their craziness. For example, if your players wish for Singe to kill your campaign's big bad, you can simply say it would cost too much to do. But after doing so comes a big moment I completely leave in your hands as a dungeon master. Is Singe a loving, good-natured person who will use his powers for good? Or have you given your players a potential new villain who becomes corrupted by power? So, a bunch of interesting lore built over the course of your campaign that leads to planar travel, a slave revolt, and the granting of a literal wish? I think this is all quite spicy enough. But if we wanted to, how can we make it even spicier? Well, I've talked long enough in this video, so for that, I'm going to toss it over to my good friend Adam from the Stubborn Heroes podcast to go over a few ways he took this idea of an encounter and truly made it his own. Adam, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. And hello, my name is Adam, and I recently had the pleasure of having Matt join our cast for a few episodes on my show where we played out a version of this very encounter. Now that Matt has provided us with a general setup for this bad boy, I think it's time to show you how I took this encounter, spiced it up, and made it my own. The first thing I did was that I changed the lore to make it suit my needs of my own homebrew world. So instead of Gokano, he became the pirate king Salazar Black. Once in service to the elemental lord of fire, the Efreeti became lost in the material plane thousands of years ago after the Age of Elements. This is when he disguised himself as a human pirate named Salazar Black and rose to power as a tyrant of the seas. So you should think about Gokano and how you can mold and bend him to suit your own world's needs. Number 2, I tied it to a player's backstory. Having Singe be an NPC is great and all, but this encounter becomes much more meaningful when the role of Singe is taken on by a player, which in this case was Matt, as he was the one playing Singe Embora. That being said, almost any Genassi's backstory can be tied into this one, since they rarely know their parents. But even if you don't have a Genassi, any character with an evil figure in their backstory can easily have a Gokano, or, in my case, a Salazar Black. Be that villain, even if it takes giving them a disguise. And lastly, Mephit slingshots, baby. Yep, you heard that right. To compensate for the lack of a wish spell, I decided to bulk up the fiery henchman in the encounter with a little trick borrowed from Matt's Fire Giant video. 2 slingshots were placed at the far end of the volcano throne room. On their turn, 2 Pirates of the Flame can use their actions to load and launch the Mephit at the group, which will explode on impact. This splash damage will add a real dangerous dynamic to the battle and make it much more memorable for your players. So, that's what I did to spice it up, and that's it for me. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Adam. If you guys want to see more of Adam and the Stubborn Heroes, make sure to check out their actual play podcast set in the world of the Isles of Umbra, an ancient, unexplored land of myth and legend where a group of outcasts form an unexpected bond to face danger small and world-ending alike. And guess what? I was a featured guest who played a version of Singe in my own weird way, so make sure to check that out as well. Links will be in the description. But anyways, this was just one of many ways you can use Efreeti in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. But if you do want to use this in your future games, make sure to let me know how it goes. Thanks for watching and indulging my hidden nerdy side.